Excellent. Good. Okay. Well, it's a very, very warm welcome. Although I understand those of you that are in the UK, particularly in the south, it's actually still a little bit chilly, but hopefully the conversation during this webinar will warm things up for you. Thank you very much for taking the time out to join us for this webinar. We're very pleased and excited to welcome Alan Kennedy, sir, and Stephen Jones to talk about the research that's been going on within Northern Ireland, and a particularly interesting approach to what we understand by increasing resilience to climate change that we can all learn from, even though we're not necessarily located in Northern Ireland. This webinar represents a series of webinars that the UK Climate Resilience Programme have developed. Those from the past you can watch, if you would like, on YouTube. This is being recorded just for your knowledge. So if you want to watch this again, you have that opportunity to do so. Before we hear from Alan and Stephen, I just want to run through a few housekeepings and just a few points of interest just to let you know about. So hopefully you can see the presentation that I'm currently sharing with you. First of all, just a reminder of the timings. So we're a little bit late in starting to allow participants to join, but hopefully we've got the majority here now. It's a good number. So again, thanks everybody. A little introduction to who I am. So my name is Pete Walton. I joined the UK Climate Resilience Programme back in July as an Impact Translation Fellow. So I'm working with colleagues across projects, thinking about how we can support and enhance the incredible work that they've been doing, increasing that policy impact and practice impact as a result. And I've been given the great privilege of hosting this event, and it's my first one. So I'm very much looking forward to sharing this moment with you. In a moment, as I say, once we've gone through a few housekeepings and a few bits of news, we're going to hear from Alan from the University of Bristol, who will be talking about this incredible title, The Unquantifiable Story-Based Approaches to Climate Change Risk Research. We'll then hear from Stephen Jones from Climate Northern Ireland, who will provide a reflection on what Alan had been referring to, talking about his research, and particularly what it means from that policy perspective. We're going to then have an opportunity to have some Q&A, which Stephen and Alan will be able to respond to, and then we'll look to end promptly at 1 o'clock. So in terms of how you can engage as participants, hopefully, although one of the attendees has just noted that they don't have the same usual toolbar, but if you do have the toolbar open, you will see that there is a Q&A button. If you click on that, you're able to type your questions. So as you're listening to Alan and Stephen, if you'd like to post any questions, then you're more than welcome to do so in the Q&A section. But what you can also do is vote. So if there is a question that someone has posted, you think, yeah, I really like that, then please give it a thumbs up, give it a like, and then we will know that that's a particular popular question, and I know as the host to focus in on those. If you don't vote, then I will just select appropriately. So this is your opportunity to make sure that the questions that get asked are the ones that are most relevant for you. A quick reminder that all attendees will remain muted unless it's particularly necessary for you to speak. I can't see any particular need, and certainly there hasn't been in the past, with the opportunities to ask questions within the Q&A function. A quick reminder that the webinar, it is being recorded, and the audio and the slides, they will be shared after the event through YouTube and on the website. If you have any technical problems, can you use the chat function, not the Q&A? We'll keep an eye on the chat. We have two colleagues from the UK Climate Resilience Programme who are on hand to help resolve anything. but hopefully everything will be plain sailing for you. Just a quick reminder whilst we're on this slide that there are a number of channels that you can engage with UK Climate Resilience Programme. If you are tweeting during this webinar, if you could use the UKCRP or make reference to the UKCRP Twitter handle and then the hashtag, that would be great. If you want further information about the excellent work which we do, a bit of self-promotion, then we have the link to the website as well there. So just some quick news just to highlight what's going on. Apologies for the typo on the left-hand side title. So NERC and ESRC have announced some impact awards, 2 different deadlines, depending on which research council you would be fall under, but it's for those who have been funded through those particular programs who want to put themselves forward for having achieved great impact. For NERC, you can see the deadline there is towards the end of April, and then the ESRC is a lot sooner. That happens middle of February. Hopefully, if you're part of those networks already, you've been advised of those, but if you haven't, I would encourage you to apply. It's there is a cash prize, but certainly for the ESRC, there's also an extended prize of having videos made of your work as well. There's a couple of links there that will take you directly to their websites for further information. Just a quick heads up about ECHA. Those of you that haven't been to ECHA in the past, I would thoroughly encourage you to attend the European Climate Change Adaptation Conference. I've been. It's an excellent opportunity to hear about the latest research, not just from a European perspective, but from an international, broader perspective, and an amazing opportunity to network. So be aware of those dates, June the 19th to the 21st, to be held in Dublin this year. Go to the ECHA website, you'll find further information there. Just to highlight some of the work that we've been doing, if you're not familiar with all the amazing products and tools and outputs, etc., that we've been involved with through the UK Climate Resilience Programme, there's this interesting tool that Charlotte Brown through the Bristol City Council has developed in terms of trying to identify heat mapping, and she developed this tool to help map vulnerable areas, particularly or focusing on Bristol, but obviously there's a lot of policy implications to think beyond Bristol and what it might mean elsewhere within the UK. So I would encourage you to look at the website and to read up a little bit more about that tool that she's developed. Just a quick reminder about the city packs that have been developed. These are primarily through the Met Office as a really useful engagement tool to get that climate change adaptation conversation started. These have been particularly valuable. If you're interested in your own area, then you can contact the Met Office, and they have a waiting list to look to develop these further. And I understand that they're also trying to think about how we can automate this process. You can develop your own. There's a whole range of academic papers which are coming out through the programme. There's a selection that you can see on the slide here. But if you go to the UKCRP website, you can see the full list of journal publications there. So without further ado, I'd like to pass on now to Alan Cundy, who was part of the Embedded Researcher Programme funded through the UK Climate Resilience Programme, working in with Climate Northern Ireland on how we can understand how to communicate and better engage climate change risk. When Alan isn't involved with developing these amazing approaches, he's working at the University of Bristol and working on the another UK CRP programme called OpenClim. Alan, I'm sure I haven't done justice at all to the work that you've been doing, but we thoroughly look forward to hearing what you have to say about this particular aspect of your research. So I'll stop sharing my screen and hand over to you.
Great, thank you very much, Pete. Thank you for the introduction. I think that was a good introduction. I just like to confess at this point that the imposter syndrome is real. As Pete said, I am a physical geographer, climate scientist, how I'd normally define myself, and somehow I'm here speaking to 80 of you about story-based approaches and arts-based approaches to research. So this is something which I started dabbling in during this embedded researcher placement with Climate Northern Ireland that Pete mentioned. But as I say, my background is in physical science. And yeah, I'll just start thinking about climate risk research and from a physical science perspective, how do we approach that? I've put together a very handy visual guide for you here. So if we've got a climate risk problem, I'm a researcher, presumably there's somebody who has a problem and I want to make my research useful to them to solve this problem. So here's me sitting on the left and here is somebody sitting on the right. We're going to call them the stakeholder, and we're going to have a bit of a conversation about the problem that they're facing. I'm then going to go away and I'm going to use my brain and I'm going to think about their problem, and then I'm going to crunch some numbers, use some data, use some models, and be able to tell them something about the problem that hopefully helps them solve the problem. I'll then present these numbers to the stakeholder and their friends, and the stakeholder and the friends will then take what I've told them. They will turn it into something useful, either change policy or change one of their processes. They'll put it into action, we'll solve the problem, and we'll all go for a beer. That's ideally what happens. It goes from there to there. In the real world, we tend to iterate around a few times. So I'll show them some numbers and go back to the drawing board with the stakeholder, and they'll say, I don't really like this, or that bit doesn't make sense, or kind of a bit more or something else. We'll repeat that a few times and then we'll present it. That's also fine. I'll accept that. Sometimes when it comes to this presentation time, I end up getting just more questions from the stakeholders and their friends. This isn't meant to sound patronizing. Sometimes I think the stakeholders themselves don't know what they want, or alternatively, I actually can't even produce numbers in the first place to show to them. And all of a sudden, this nice chain that leads from me at the start to the beer at the end starts to fall apart a little bit. And all the while, the clock is ticking. So that's the usual sort of situation I face as a data-driven climate risk researcher working, as Pete said, on OpenClim as a project. So when I'm sitting trying to code up models and do this analysis, quite often, my mind might wander if I'm waiting for some code to compile or upload or run. And I started thinking about some of these questions, that what if the real world is actually much more complex and doesn't quite match the theory that we're trying to code up in these models. A good example of this, something which in the climate NI placement I did a lot, was work with farmers. You can come up with a great equation that shows what will happen because of heat on a farm, but actually in reality every farm is very, very different and none of them really quite match the theory. Another question I wonder about a lot is, what if there's more than one answer and they potentially contradict each other? On the OpenClim project, I focus on the impacts of high temperatures and summer heat. One of the things we would love to look at is residential discomfort and how uncomfortable someone is during a heat wave. But of course, for that, there's not one answer. What makes me feel uncomfortably hot will be very different to what makes you feel very uncomfortably hot. So trying to put an equation to that and a threshold in many ways can be a bit sort of meaningless. We'll still try, it's still a useful approximation, but it's not telling the whole story. And then finally, this one's a bit more reflective, I suppose. We're obviously facing a lot of challenges with climate, how it's changing and how we might stop it changing. And we've typically approached that with a very sort of quantitative, scientific, data-driven mentality. And we're still facing a lot of the problems that we've been facing and known about for decades now. So maybe we need some fresh ideas as to how we might move forward and make progress on action. So this is the sort of stuff I've been mulling over as I was doing my my modeling for OpenClim, and sort of sowed the seeds for this embedded researcher placement. And when we wrote the proposal, we were interested particularly in how we could think about story to dig a little bit deeper than what I can do just with modeling alone. And I don't know what sort of breakdown we've got in the audience today, but I imagine there's a fair number of you are climate scientists or policy specialists, someone who's not really into arts research. And I want to reassure you that you shouldn't be scared. I'm not some mad hippie. I would argue, as a good starting point, it's worth remembering that our climate resilience research that goes on within the program is already totally interwoven with fiction. It's everywhere and amongst it. If we're in a real room, I'd get you to shout out examples, but here is one that I like thinking about quite a lot. The UK SSPs, right? I think it's an intriguing project because it's totally vital for thinking about climate impacts in the future. It's understanding how society changes. They are really complex and they're really detailed, but at the same time, it's kind of crazy and ridiculous to think that you could simplify all of the possible features into these 5 scenarios. And this was just something that I've been mulling over and something that I wanted to sort of question and probe at a little bit with this placement with Climate Northern Ireland. The questions I was sort of interested in answering is, whose voices do we include in coming up with what the future might look like? Who is an expert and of what? And can we come up with alternative potential futures? So I was interested with this Climate Northern Ireland placement and focusing on rural Northern Ireland. And so I thought it'd be interesting to do the most arty piece of this project as some storytelling workshops with people who live in rural Northern Ireland to see what their views of the future are and how they compare to what someone based, say, in Cambridge thinks rural Northern Ireland will be like in the future. So going with that idea, we organised these workshops, which we call Time Travelling in the Northern Irish Countryside. And we had a group of young people, there's about 8 young people aged 17 to 26 who all lived in rural and coastal Northern Ireland. This is, for those of you who don't really know geography of Northern Ireland, Belfast is just out of shot at the bottom of the screen here. But they all lived in this area. And we were interested to know what was their first meaningful memory or connection with the natural environment. We wanted them to think about how the environment was changing and where it might be in the future. And we organised these as a pair of storytelling workshops that were organised by a local storyteller called Liz Weir. And we got them to write short but getting increasingly longer pieces on each of these topics. So what you can see on this map is the reflections on like the first memory of the countryside. And it's just interesting to see what these young people suggested. Some of them are take place in what I'd say is quite touristy outdoor spaces, so like the Mourne Mountains, along the Antrim coast at Carnlough. Those are sort of quintessentially nice bits of countryside. But some of the other memories occur in really random places like Dunloy, or I hadn't even heard of Gortnahy. But this was the first meaningful connection that this young person recalled with the countryside. So I thought that was interesting that these can happen anywhere. They don't just happen in national parks and at beauty spots. And then going on from there, we asked the young people to think about how might this space that they remembered, they had this connection, how might it change in the future? We asked them to write a short story. And based upon all of their individual stories, we all got back together, they all told their stories. And then Liz Weir, the host, went and took extracts from all of them and pieced them together into one narrative. So that was the main output, which is shown here. I won't read the whole thing just now, but I'll pick out a few examples of little bits from it. So our story begins in a land once famed for its vibrant green grass and plentiful, clean, fresh air. A land well watered by soft rain, and edged with crashing waves. Our story ends. We know not how or when for sure, but let's begin. And then the story, what I find really interesting is it holds this kind of dynamic equilibrium between like different ideas that are juxtaposed against each other. So there's old and new. It starts off with this kind of nostalgic look back on the past, and it compares that to, say, future green energy generation systems. It contrasts the supernatural and folklore with like fairy tales here, and talking about this ancient god in Irish mythology called Cernunnos, with a very much sort of grounded, realistic view of what's happening in the environment today. And also, really importantly, I think it focuses a lot on ideas of like hope versus fear. And okay, obviously Liz has pulled this together and given it a bit of this balance, but the majority of the stories all included this kind of, there's positives and then there's negatives, but actually maybe there's also still some positives that we can pick out. So for example, you know, we've got along the blazing trail of green nestled between the bricks, there were once ducks dipping their beaks into the cool burn. Now algae chokes the stream, the blue-green water thick with slurry seepage, fish stocks long gone. Will all the green fields be replaced by scorched earth, discoloured, dilapidated, depleted? Very negative imagery in some of these stories that the young people told, but then look there, amongst the trees stands a forgotten house reclaimed by nature and time. Once people have gone, nature's resilience can reclaim what was stolen from her. Life can still find a way if it is given room to. Nothing yet is too far gone. Imagine sitting under a cold, dark night sky, not ruined by light pollution. Imagine being able to visit those hidden places unspoilt by the impact of over-tourism, undisclosed location where no one knows your face or asks for directions. Imagine gannets diving far off the coast from West Bay, still fish to catch. I love how they've got this positive and negative throughout, and there are these glimmers of hope that sort of keep coming up. And I think this is really important, a really important point. You know, it didn't, in the end, this story didn't write a new SSP like I expected it to. Well, I think that's kind of part of the process of co-production. You never quite know what you're going to get at the end. But instead, it gave me this reflection, and it made me think a lot about our current situation and the theme of eco-anxiety. So I'm gonna start thinking about that more now for the rest of the talk. But what I think is also really interesting is this story is not unique and it's not new. And actually, we've had positive and negative stories about the environment for a very long time, decades, centuries even. And again, so while I was doing this placement with Climate NI, it gave me a lot of time to reflect and to think about things very differently from my usual sort of scientific perspective. And I started thinking about poems and folk songs and folk stories and where the environment features in those. And I'd like to share with you now a song. It's this is a traditional folk song. It's written about a place just down the road from where I live and where I grew up. This is a version by a band called True. Very much recommend you give it a listen. So the song's called Bonny Portmore, and it tells the story of a great oak tree that fell in 1760. Let's see if it plays.
Oh, Bonny Portmore, I am sorry for to see the woeful destruction of your ornament tree. You stood on these shores for many's the long day, till the long boats of Antrim came to float you away. Oh, Bonny Portmore, you shine where you stand, and the more I think on you, the more I think along. But if I had you not as I had you before. The lords of old England could not purchase Portmore. Oh, the birds in the forest, they bitterly weep, crying, where can I shelter and where can I sleep? The oak and the ash have all been cut down, and the walls of Bonny Portmore are fell to the ground. Oh, Bonny Portmore, I am sorry for to see the woeful destruction of your ornament tree.
So, as I said, that song is over 250 years old, as far as I know. There we go. I put the words up here just so you can have a bit of a read, but I'd like to just talk you through and reflect on some of those. So, it's a very old story, but I think it's got so many parallels with where we currently are. So the song is lamenting the loss of this particular tree called the ornament tree at Portmore, where there's a loch at Portmore, and this was in a forest next to the loch. The tree fell in a storm, so it was due to natural causes. However, it was the kind of human build-up to that and the land management that made the loss so difficult. So the village next to Portmore, where I grew up, is called Ballinderry. The townland where I grew up is called Cululta. And in Gaelic, those names, Ballinderry means Town of the Oaks, and Cululta means Forest of Ulster. The whole area used to be covered in big, big forests of oak and ash. And over the course of, I don't know, a few hundred years ago, the land was gradually either sold off or claimed by the English from Gaelic clans, and it was repurposed into agricultural farmland, much like it still is today. But in 1760, there was still a few pockets of that original old woodland still remaining. Particularly, there was an area called the Deer Park next to Portmore, where this great tree stood. But crucially, the big landscape of trees had been fragmented until there was just these small isolated pockets left, which makes it harder to lose, any one part of that when it does finally go. If you had 1 million trees and one fell over, you probably wouldn't notice. If you had 100 and one fell over, you'd be pretty sad. And if you've got 10 and one falls over, it's even worse. And I think there's a really interesting parallel here again, with the modern day. It talks here about the oak and the ash being the trees. And we've lost a lot of the oak trees around Ballinderry, but we've still got lots of hedgerows lined with ash. As ash dieback slowly eats its way along those hedgerows through the countryside, the few trees that are there are going to be gone, which is even harder for us and for the nature, for the birds of the forest, as referenced here, to absorb that loss, because there's really no other alternatives for them to go to. So I don't know. I think it's really interesting that we're still singing this 250 years on, and I wonder will people be singing folk songs lamenting today's losses in 250 years. And this, it opens up a door to a whole load of questions about how we tell stories about the crisis that we're facing at the moment. Like, life is full of crises at the minute: the nature crisis, biodiversity, climate crisis, and so on. And they all kind of fall under this umbrella of the Anthropocene. And yeah, while I was doing this work, I read a really interesting kind of critique of the Anthropocene by a Canadian scholar. And he points out, his name's Kyle White, points out that the idea of the Anthropocene is very sort of Western centric, you know, this idea that everything was fine, it was okay until about 100 years ago, and then it all went belly up. And actually, if you take an Indigenous North American perspective on that, actually things got bad hundreds of years before that, when the first European colonists arrived and started changing the ecosystem, changing the way of life of people there. And actually they would almost view the world that we live in now as already being a dystopia, whereas quite often the angle that's given the Anthropocene is we're standing on the brink of a dystopia in the future. So, you know, thinking about stories and thinking about narratives and who's telling the narrative is really important, I think. And, you know, just to come back to Portmore, I think it's important that the climate research community is careful with how we communicate the changes and the losses, because yes, trees will fall down, but they will also regrow. And but next to Portmore, where the tree was, there's the loch, Portmore Loch, and that area is now an RSPB reserve. So, you know, there is still hope. And as the story which the young people had told, that we wrote with Liz Weir, there was the quote saying, "Nothing yet is too far gone." You know, we can allow things to recover, and I think that's a really positive message. But while we're on the topic of 18th century literature and uncertainties about the future, it would be rude not to be Burns Night and not recite a wee bit of Robbie Burns himself. It's a great poem, and again, I think there's just a great resonance here for environmental researchers. This is a poem called To a Moose, or To a Mouse on Turning Her Up in Her Nest with the Plough, November 1785. It's a great title. All the details. So again, nearly 250 years on from when this was written. I'm going to take a verse from the middle and the two verses at the end. Apologies to anyone who's Scottish in the audience. My pronunciation of Scots dialect will be terrible, but anyway, we'll see how we get on. I'm truly sorry man's dominion has broken nature's social union and justifies that ill opinion which makes thee startle at me, thy poor earth-born companion and fellow mortal. So Robbie here is sort of empathizing with this mouse, and he's recognizing that we're all living beings on the planet together, which is cool. But I think what's really interesting here is he's also recognizing that humans are already having a disproportionate effect on the negative world. You know, basically, man has this reputation. It justifies the ill opinion that makes nature afraid of man and the impact that man can have. In this case, destroying the mouse's nest. Again, this is way before we started thinking and worrying about the damage we're doing on the environment. The poem then goes on. But mousie, thou art to know thy lane, improving foresight may be vain. The best laid schemes of mice and men gang after gley, and layest not but grief and pain for promised joy. Still, thou art blessed compared with me, the present only toucheth thee, but ach, backward cast me ye on prospects drear, and forward, though I cannae see, I guess and fear. So again, here, Robbie's comparing his life to that of the mouse, but I suppose he's sort of wishfully thinking that the mouse only lives in the present. It doesn't have to worry about the past and the future, and that's what humans tend to do a lot. We look back on the past with nostalgia or regrets or whatever it might be, and we imagine what the future might be like. In this bit, you know, I backward cast my eye on what has happened, and forward I cast my eye, even though I can't see, I guess, and fear. So we'll never know what the future will hold, but even 250 years ago, people were potentially having worries about it. And I just think that's very prescient as a climate researcher. And I also would just love to know what Robbie Burns would think of RCP 8.5. He'd be terrified of that, I'm sure. So I don't know, it's this poem to me starts asking questions about, you know, how much knowledge is good knowledge? Do we need all the knowledge that we have? Do we need more numbers, as Pete said in the introduction? And I feel like the way potentially climate science researchers like myself have gone in the past is we've maybe had too much sort of zeal to encourage policymakers to act and to raise awareness of the issues of climate change. And I wonder, maybe have we banged the drum too much, because too much data and too much numbers can sort of put people into this state of like despair or malaise, because they don't know what the future holds, but it doesn't look great. And so it's all pointless. Why would I bother changing anything? And actually, we need to sort of reframe our stories. I think that's a really important point. And yeah, just to go back full circle now, I'd like to go back to the stories from the workshop we ran with Climate NI. And again, some of them actually touched on very similar topics to this, to what Robbie Burns was talking about all those years ago. This idea of what knowledge do we actually need? So these are just a few quotes from different stories that the young people put together, not necessarily the final story. The first one was from a story called The Unspoken Water, and it says, you know, the storyteller in this case was drawing water in silence from a river and thinking about the ache of what could be following in my wake, and this unknown and the pain potentially that can cause for the future. And then as well as that, one of the other exercises we did was thinking about, we asked the young people to respond to what the countryside is to them. And one of them said, the countryside is best left to its own devices. And again, I sort of think this reflects on this idea of knowledge. Like sometimes as humans, we maybe overthink things, we over-engineer, or we come up with these overly complicated technical solutions to try and solve a problem, only to discover it has a knock-on effect somewhere else in the system that also then subsequently needs solved. And sometimes maybe we should just take a back seat and just let nature do its thing, which is an interesting suggestion. Again, this idea, this is another quote, I like not being able to describe the landscape. Sometimes a lack of knowledge is its own strength. I find this quite tricky to come to terms with potentially as a researcher, because you always want more knowledge, but you have to accept that sometimes maybe for other people that's not what they want or think they require. And this same story that was from goes on to continue. Nobody knows about this place. Tomorrow they tell me a gardener named Neil will bring his equipment and cut down the overgrowth, shaping new pathways within old quarters in an attempt to make the land whole. I think Neil will fail. In fact, I'm rooting for it. And I think that goes all the way back to, you know, one of the things I said at the start, this idea that there can be more than one right answer as to what to do in life with anything. And stories can be quite a good way of framing both of those at the same time. The arts can frame both two sides of a story at the same time. So in this case, in the story, I assume that the local council, whoever, has decided they should send a nail to make a nice little green space for people to use. And I'm sure some people will use it, and that'd be great. But some people who already use the wild green space don't actually want it kind of changed and sanitized. They like the tranquility, and I'm sure the nature also appreciates the wildness of the space. So there's not really a right answer as to what to do here. And you could do a cost-benefit analysis, lots of data to show what, you know, pros and cons of both. You could also just write 3 sentences, 3 lines of a story, which really cuts to the point and you know, frames these two contrasting ideas against each other. And I think that's something that's really neat about using these kind of story and arts-based approaches. So those are all my examples I'm going to show you. I'm just going to leave you now with a few key reflections that hopefully you'll take away from this, and maybe some ideas you can take forward. So in terms of reflections, hopefully you've enjoyed this talk, and I would say please don't fear the arts. For example, the likes of these stories are all around us. We tell stories every day, and we use stories in our work, such as SSPs or RCPs. And it's just one thing to use them, and then it's okay to sort of question them and then think, maybe I could write my own SSP. And before you know it, you're doing an arts-based workshop. So don't be scared. You never know. It's quite interesting. Another key reflection for me personally is that the real world isn't like a climate model or a lab. As I mentioned, I did a lot of work with Climate NI, working with farmers and thinking about rural areas. And I think farming is a perfect example. Lots of things make sense in theory, but in reality, it varies from farm to farm. And what's cool about the arts is that they can hold these contradictory, complex truths at the same time, which can be helpful if trying to understand a messy reality. They're not going to solve all the problems that a farm might face. That's not what I'm trying to say, but it's just a different way of approaching problems that's maybe a little bit more open-minded at times than science can be. And yeah, final reflection is that arts-based methods, I think, can open up environmental research to new voices, whether that's non-academic communities like the folks I had at my workshops. It can be for non-quantitatively minded people. I did some other workshops which I gave people what I would class as one of the simplest graphs you could have, like here's time, here's temperature, and it goes like this. Some people didn't get it, couldn't get it, but by asking them to write poetry, they were able to tell me how they interacted with high temperatures and what made them uncomfortable. And finally, I think you can also, potentially engage with past generations. So I gave examples of those songs written hundreds of years ago, and that gives us an insight into what those people thought back then without having, a well-validated survey to draw on. So just taking that forward, I'd say my main thing, which I'd like everybody, regardless of your background, is today to do is to use narratives wisely to contextualize the current environmental challenges. The challenges are not new, and if we solve them now, there will be further challenges in the future. Like there's always been positives and negatives and ups and downs, and that's okay. And people shouldn't be full of fear and full of eco-anxiety. I think the arts-based methods can add extra value to quantitative research. So if you're interested in people's viewpoints, sure, you can do a survey, great. But taking the extra bit of time, spending 2 days doing a workshop, really allows people to elaborate on it. And this was feedback I got from the Education Authority, who helped me recruit participants. And they said the emphasis on stories demonstrated why a young person had the view they did on the topic, more than a text box would in a survey. And finally, remember to see problems holistically and accept that the world is complex. There's not going to be one equation, one graph that solves it all, as much as I would love the Open Flame project to solve it all. Arts-based methods are one extra way of digging into this complexity. They're not going to solve all the problems, but I think we just need to embrace as many different methods as possible. So I will leave it there. Thank you so very much for listening. If you want to get in touch with me afterwards to discuss anything, fire me an email, sure. And thank you to the Climate Resilience Programme for funding, as well as some extra top of funding from Research England. So thank you. I'll pass over to Stephen.
Before you jump in, I just want to say a quick thank you, Alan, for that presentation and for reminding us just the power of storytelling and other approaches to engaging with this huge challenge. What I would encourage participants to do is to reflect on Alan's presentation while Stephen is talking, listen to what Stephen is saying, but also just to post some questions that you might want Alan to reflect on, and Stephen, in the Q&A. There's some interesting questions that's been posted. I'm not sure I understand all the questions, but hopefully Alan will do. But also some really positive feedback in terms of what the approach means to some of the participants, which is really encouraging. So thank you for sharing those positive reflections as well in terms of how you think it could impact on your work. So I would encourage you to post those questions, so that gives us something to discuss once we've heard from Stephen. But Stephen, can I pass over to you now, please?
You can. Thank you very much. I could provide a little bit of backing music while you're thinking of the questions for the Q&A. Thank you very much to Alan. I'd firstly, I suppose, like to say what a pleasure it was to have Alan with us at Climate Northern Ireland, a man of many, sometimes quite disparate skills, but he was always very giving of his time and very thoughtful in his approach. So my name is Stephen. I'm a resilience coordinator at Climate Northern Ireland, which is a cross-sectoral network seeking to progress action on adaptation and mitigation. I've been given the honour of being asked to respond a little bit to what Alan said, and so, as with all good short interventions, I have 3 main points. Thinking differently about local knowledge for climate resilience, defining a vision for a challenging future, and resilience and research as a social space. To begin then, I thought I like not being able to describe the landscape. Sometimes lack of knowledge is its own strength was a very interesting quote. I think the simplicity of approach, in terms of simplicity, it's arguably too simple, but a fresh pair of eyes like this can mean not only looking at the ones and zeros or the climate model outputs, but acknowledging the intangibles of a place and the need for qualitative, socioeconomic or environmental context, which to help make decisions in uncertainty and complexity. There's an amazing depth of knowledge and understanding that exists about areas and people and resilience, trials and errors of the past, but it may not be captured in our ordinary ways of working due to siloed work, time constraints, maybe the format or timing of our engagement, or just the fact that hazards or actions are not being attributed to climate change. And I think this becomes particularly important in Northern Ireland, which is often quite a data poor context compared to the rest of the UK. So arts and heritage, I think, can offer a real insight into the challenges that society has faced before and how they potentially overcame those. It's worth remembering that narrative can be a buzzword, and I think it has to be introduced with purpose and thoughtfully, considering how it can be used as part of a suite of approaches. I think this has been a great example, Alan's project, of where there was a holistic consideration given to both the purpose of the narrative in terms of filling a specific knowledge gap and the format in which that would take place, so as to ultimately be as useful and enjoyable as possible. Climate and I have done quite a lot of place-based work recently through the Irish EPA-funded TALEX project, and this will really help to build on that. I think increasing numbers of local communities and councils right across the UK are crying out for convening powers to be used, but we need to make sure that we make use of people when we do bring them together, and importantly, make it understood that the information will go somewhere. So I think visual artistic stimulation, facilitated conversation and art are proving to be really powerful tools in uncovering not just the answers, but as Alan touched upon, also the questions to use when shaping places, and ultimately, we hope also transforming them. My second point is around creating a vision, I suppose, and in Northern Ireland, we have a new Climate Act with lots of new ambition and short policy cycles, and yet for all the indicator research to date, we're still lacking a great deal of the scientific data that we need to make decisions in comparison to the still imperfect UK-wide picture. This fragmented government means that even when we have that quantitative data, the reality is that certain decisions are inherently political and complex and don't have easy answers. And therefore we need ways of organizing that simply are not just top down, especially in a governance vacuum like we have at the moment. I think we're in danger of throwing around terms sometimes like just transition without fully and genuinely understanding the engagement and time needed to make that work. And to me, Alan's work, I think, begs the question, when has a community been engaged? To what extent should we examine and account for any difference in mindset between the urban and rural, the younger and older stakeholders? And at the end of all this, how will all of these things affect the way that society defines acceptable risk and acceptable change, which is ultimately the greatest conversation that I think as a society we have yet to undertake on adaptation, and that needs to be had in so many different sectors. I think we can build on this in Northern Ireland. Certainly, Alan has touched on the kind of rural element of his work, and there's a new project around rural resilience, which is started with Climate Northern Ireland, which is really exciting. And so Alan's work will help with both narrative and actual data, which will also have kind of wider significance too. The final point I'd like to touch on was just around the kind of social element of this. I was kind of struck by the range of different social groups and the ages that Alan had worked with. And we in Climate NI now have a paper trail of how some of these groups could be approached in more detail in future. I like the idea of embracing narrative, especially in such an artistic society as we have over here. I think that this approach could well work with all ages in a similar way to how community food growing, for example, can provide real ownership and it feels like it's something that's tangible and accessible. Co-production workshops are an interesting way to engage people in research, but there's also the additional element of making these ideas about climate change and resilience real to people, and using research as a social meeting space, giving them the room, an opportunity to think differently about an area or a complex topic, which in many instances might leave them often feeling powerless. I think in an era of increasingly fragmented and frantic public conversation, we may yet see more emphasis returned to the local as people seek to ground themselves. And certainly eco-anxiety is a is partly a result of this and a result of the stories that we tell. Alan believes that these can be reframed to offer some hope, and I agree. So I'd like to leave it there. Thank you.
That's wonderful. Thank you ever so much, Stephen, for those reflections. And it's interesting, you're picking up on some of the themes and ideas that are coming up in the Q&A. Time marches on, as so often happens within these sorts of webinars. And I appreciate the questions which have been posted and some of the upvoting that's been going on. Working on that process of which has received the most votes. There's a question from Jana, if that's how you pronounce your name, Jana. Apologies if I've mispronounced it. Alan, can you see the Q&A?
Yeah, I can.
And
yeah.
you can see the one at the bottom. So Jana's asking about working mostly with data. We often forget to bring emotion into the picture. How do you think storytelling might also serve as a way of raising awareness of civil society and decision makers in politics, planning, etc., for the need of adaptation planning? And I think Stephen touched on some of these points as well. So Stephen, you might want to come in as well on this question, but thanks for posting that question. Thanks for voting for it. How do you answer it? How do you see this?
Yeah, well, it is a good question. And I think it's a very important one. I think it's significantly better to take this kind of method, in my opinion, than to take a scientific perspective. If you want to convey the emotion that goes with it, you know, it doesn't take long dipping into stories or poems and songs to feel the emotion coming out of them. The one thing that I would note is that it's also important not to just make decisions purely based on emotions. So it needs to be balanced again, which I think is sort of the theme of this talk a lot is, you know, science is useful and great until it can't go any further, and then other approaches are useful. So yeah, I wouldn't just knee-jerk to tell stories to essentially brainwash people into being scared or empowered or whatever to do to do what I want them to do. But it's definitely, I'd say, the most effective way to convey emotions. Far more emotion would be passed that way than through a graph.
If I may just dip in very briefly,
Please do.
I think actually there's an interesting dynamic in this and dichotomy where in some ways you might be using these narratives to reduce emotion a little bit as well, or channel emotion in the right way towards something that is productive rather than feeling powerless. So I think this is what I mean about the kind of thoughtful element of this, which I thought Alan did really well. And I think there's a lot to build on. It's not just about narrative for narrative's sake. You know, what are we really driving at? And is there a real clear perspective that we're trying to get to with all this? Yeah.
That's great. No, thank you very much, both of you, for responding to that question. I'm conscious of time. We've got 3 minutes left. And whilst I would love to do justice to some of these questions, I don't think we're going to have time if we're going to finish, promptly on time. But I think it's certainly as a presentation and as is being thought-provoking. And also, I was really interested by Caroline's comment right at the very end about having an approach validated. Too often, as you rightly say, it's around the physical sciences, it's around the natural sciences, etc. And actually, when we try to introduce new skills, new approaches, new ideas, there's some pushback. So the fact that we have that reinforcement that other people are doing it, they are trialing it, but in a practical way, then we know as practitioners who are helping in this process that we're on the right lines. And that was really important. So thank you for offering that up as well. What I would like to do just before we say our final farewells is just to highlight. I did mention right at the very start that the UK Climate Resilience Programme has been running a series of webinars throughout its existence, and they won't stop today. We are running more webinars between now and the end of the programme, which is due to finish in March. You can see the dates and times and titles and who the speakers and respondents are. These are listed on the website, so you can find further details there. What I would say is that given the round of strikes and industrial actions, etc., that are currently going on, these may change in light of if the UCU, the university lecturers, one of the university lecturer unions goes on strike, colleagues may wish to respect that. So if you can keep an eye on those dates, if you've registered, if we do change the dates, you will get automatically notified through the Zoom process. And once again, just a reminder of the contact details. You can reach us through the website. There's a contact us page, there's Twitter, and there's the YouTube channel where you'll find this presentation. Now, we have 30 seconds left, which is not nearly enough time to thank Alan and Stephen for their time today in introducing not necessarily a novel approach, but certainly an exciting approach. It's nice to be reminded that this has been something which we've been talking about for hundreds of years, and it's got lost in the data. And actually, it's something that needs to be brought forward in such a powerful way as you identified. And it's an incredibly engaging way of doing it without losing sight that it's not the panacea, it's not the silver bullet to all our climate change adaptation woes, that we need to recognize that it's part of the arsenal, and we need to recognize how it fits in. And certainly the work that's been highlighted in the Q&A through our participants, and thank you very much for sharing those links. Hopefully we can build on what you've done, Alan, and what you've been able to support Stephen through this brilliant research. Thank you very much to everybody else for participating and engaging in this webinar, and for working with us on the webinars. And we very much look forward to welcoming you to the next series of webinars, which will be happening, as I mentioned, throughout February. I hope you enjoy the rest of your days. It is now 1 minute past, so for timekeeping as a host, we haven't done too badly, but thanks very much indeed. And as I say,